One of the traits that we share in common is how good it feels to laugh now and then. It's been said that laughter is the best medicine. You know that. But do you know that it's actually true? There's actually some scientific support. Can you imagine making that your doctor's dissertation, your research, to determine how much laughter improves your well-being? I'm sure it's been done. Because when you laugh, your body tends to relax. And it releases chemicals that are called endorphins that actually make you feel better. But it's more than that. It increases the body's natural pain-killing response. And that can help with chronic pain and improve your mood. Laughter can even increase blood flow to internal organs because it makes you breathe harder, breathe deeper, and it's actually good for you to do that. Now, people will laugh for any number of reasons. It can happen when we observe someone doing something silly, right? When it comes to comedy or humor, we laugh at the punchline, which is something where a story is kind of going along and then suddenly it takes a twist at the end. We laugh at that. Maybe that's why many preachers really are more like frustrated stand-up comics in some ways. We tend to laugh when we see a pet or a child doing something wacky, right? There are so many videos that are out there, and every once in a while I'll hear laughter in the other room from Dawn because she's watching some video, and her favorites have to do with the little Labrador Retriever puppies that she follows. It's also good to be able to laugh at ourselves when we do something that is out of alignment. But for me personally, what really gets me going, laughing, are you ready? It's when a telemarketer calls. Not right away. Not right away. The laughter comes later. You have to get prepared for that moment. Now, robocalls are never any fun. But when a real person asks the question, "How are you today?" I know we are in for a fun ride. I see that question as an opportunity to expound on all the ailments that come to mind, real and imagined, and about how people are telling me about what I should be doing about those ailments. I don't have any grandchildren, but I tell about my imaginary grandchildren telling me about, "Grandpa, you ought to be doing this, about that." That's what I tell this person. And I also give the reasons why I haven't gotten around to doing what my imaginary granddaughter is telling me to do, which then opens the door for the opportunity to ask the person on the other end of the phone if they have any experience regarding one particular ailment and any advice that they would be able to give to me. Because I tell them I really do value the opinions of others. And when they say words to the effect that that's not why I called, that becomes an opportunity to expound on the reason why we all should be health conscious, not to mention being concerned for the environment and being good citizens in our nation, which reminds me to say, did you vote last Tuesday? I hope you did, didn't you? Because we all have to do our part in making this country the greatest one on earth, where we all get a say in how things are done, and where we have so many freedoms, and where the buffalo roam, and all those kinds of things. And then I'll say, well, of course that means I assume you're calling from the good old US of A, aren't you? Now, depending on the answer, that could go any number of directions. But sometimes, at that point, I just decide to say goodbye after having adequately answered the question, "How are you today?" And then I return to my normal life, all satisfied, relaxed, and ready to resume my normal life. You see, that is true, that laughter can be the best medicine. But laughter can have a dark side as well. Really, we could talk about Schadenfreude, right? Schadenfreude is a German word that is all about deriving pleasure or laughing at the misfortune of others. Maybe laughing at the expense of a telemarketer is Schadenfreude. I don't know. But some people take things to another level when laughter becomes mean-spirited. I'm really laughing at your demise. I think that happens in a lot of ways in our nation because the laughter of a bully is like that. Laughter, in many respects, is a window into the soul. For it can be easy to laugh at something that you wouldn't otherwise speak out loud. That's why there are certain kind of jokes that I will not tell. There's some boundaries that I will not cross because I believe it will actually give somebody an opportunity to laugh at it when they're actually agreeing with kind of the downside to that. Your laughter can be an indication that you doubt something to be true. That is the actual meaning behind the word that we call a scoffer. You react to something by scoffing or mocking it with words of laughter. We see that kind of laughter in the Bible in the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis. It tells the story of Abraham having an encounter with three individuals that are described as men. But by the end of the chapter, it actually tells you who these people are. Two of them are angels, and one is the Lord himself, appearing in human form. So this is one of those intriguing passages in the Tanakh that demonstrates God's ability to do whatever he pleases. I talk about this all the time, about how people like to put God in a box, that he cannot do certain kinds of things. We're going to talk about some boundaries that he does have today, but he is not limited to how he manifests himself. And it is consistent with the way that he would later on, after this passage, dwell on earth in the midst of humanity as Yeshua, the Son of God. But in this story, here in Genesis 18, the reason Adonai appears is that he is announcing that he is now going to put into effect the next phase in his redemptive plan for this world that began in chapter 12 with the announcement of the coming of the Abrahamic covenant. And it is specifically in this context the promise of a nation that would arise from Abraham, who up to this point in time does not have a legitimate heir, nor is the case for his wife Sarah to have ever had a child. Well, here's what we're told beginning in Genesis 18:10. All right, now who's speaking here? This is that third individual who is the Lord. Okay? He said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. In other words, God was promising to do something that was impossible, at least from a human perspective. Because not only was Sarah 90 years old, she had never had given birth to a child up to that point in time. See, and that's a really serious combination. But she had, she knew this very clearly, and so that she could respond in accordance with that reality from her perspective. Throughout human history, there is no record of another woman who was infertile, later giving birth at a very advanced stage of life to this extent, 90 years old. So this would be telling any one of you here that 1 year from today, you will be quarterbacking the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, it's on par with that, right? Or that 1 year from today, I will be standing on the stage of Carnegie Hall, and I will be singing the opera Marriage of Figaro. Figaro. I can do that part at least, right? That's what I'm going to be doing a year from now? Not going to happen. It's as equally impossible to what we're reading about here. But it's about human perspective. So how did Sarah respond to this divine revelation? Sarah laughed to herself. Catch that? To herself. So she thought. Saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And Adonai said, now notice here, and Adonai said to Abraham. So this is where you get the confirmation that the person that she's talking to is Adonai himself. You got to read the full context. He said to Abraham, he says, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Here's the kicker. Is anything too difficult for Adonai? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. But notice what Sarah does here. She does not acknowledge the having the son, but what she says is, she denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he, who's the he? This is Adonai, said, no, but you did laugh. I love this glimpse of her humanity. Okay? You see some echoes of Eve in this, right? Interesting. She was caught in a social faux pas by laughing in the presence of this person who was there. But she thinks she's laughing to herself, but that's not the case here, and that's why she tries to deny it. So it is very clear to me that the hearing of Adonai is very, very good. And he would not let her get away with denying that she laughed, because that would mean that he would allow her to get away from her thinking that was filled with doubt. This is like, no, we're not going to let this pass in any aspect of this denial. Now, of course, we never do that. We never think that God doesn't know about what's going on inside our brain. It's just our little secret with ourselves. Yet even though we might agree with God's omniscience intellectually, our tendency is to go about our lives like we are insulated from Him in some manner, especially in terms of keeping our deepest thoughts to ourselves. This is telling me that that is never the case. God has no boundaries, and He is fully aware of every thought that we ever have. And I would assume, I would conclude that we would all be better off if we always maintain that mindset at every given moment, so that we can put every thought under a disciplined, self-controlled monitoring system, so that it will be more in alignment with what God desires for our lives. But you know how it is. You'll leave this place, and immediately it'll start to just fade into the background. You resume your normal routines, including the normal way that we think and act. I think you will all agree that Sarah's laughter was the kind of response that you would do in a similar situation if you thought that the circumstances that are being described here are completely unattainable. Yeah, like that's going to happen. Okay? You know, because you've done that, and so have I. Initially, she laughed at it as an expression of doubt and scoffing, which is in actuality an insult to the good Lord who was standing right in front of her. The Lord was telling her this is going to happen. And she laughed in His face, in essence. Well, this would all change then with the actual birth of Isaac. I'm sure it actually began, the change in her thinking began much sooner than that, because she knew that something was happening that had never happened before, even before the birth. But as Genesis 21 begins, a son was indeed born to Sarah, as Adonai had promised, and he was named Yitzhak, or we say Isaac in English, and it comes from the verb tzachak, which means to laugh. It's kind of interesting. And Sarah made a statement that reflected having now a completely different perspective than before. We're told in verse 6, Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. So now the laughter in her life was very different. It was no longer an expression of scoffing and doubt. It was now the laughter of someone who had witnessed a miracle and having for the first time her own child to hold in her arms. She was now able to see things for the first time from God's perspective. He had done exactly what he said he was going to do. He had accomplished the impossible with the birth of her son. He had literally made laughter in the person of Isaac, and also reflected in his name. And she wanted everyone to share in that experience, but especially having this new perspective that God had given her. So this story teaches us that God, or people, may laugh at God by doubting and denying what he can do, but we can laugh with him when we recognize his omnipotence and his ability to carry out his sovereign will, and when that even includes the circumstances that seem to be impossible. And the reason that that is true is that godly laughter is not about giggles and ha-has. This passage shows that it is about discovering that there is nothing too difficult for Adonai to do when it is in line with his will. And this is the key to our understanding here. And I want to develop this further with you today. As we consider the rest of God's Word, there is a recurring theme of negative things being turned around for good in the way that God operates. That's the premise of familiar passages. Like Joseph saying to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." And as Paul declared in Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. So when we truly believe those declarations and we live out our lives in accordance with that realization, it will be reflected in our demeanor and how we express ourselves. Our lives will no longer be marked by cynical laughter of a scoffer against God and the doubt that goes with that. Instead, our lives will be marked by patience and trust and laughing with God as he brings about his will. All right, so where do we see that really being manifested in Scripture? We see that in the Brit Hadasha in the New Testament. When Yeshua was foretelling his death in his resurrection to his disciples in John chapter 16. Now, what I love about Yeshua is that he's really good about having questions asked, and he really rephrases it for the questions that you really should be asking, or he just decides to say, well, I'm not going to tell you directly, but I'm going to take you into a thought processing journey here as you process this out yourself. So on this day, he speaks to the disciples with an air of mystery. Beginning with verse 20, he said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain, because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish, because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Therefore," he says, "you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you." I can imagine the disciples hearing him talking about this stuff with this look on their faces, as they're thinking, what did he just say here? Yeshua was talking about the distinct perspectives that people would have at his death and his resurrection. Different perspectives at the cross, that his disciples would be grieving, but those who opposed him would be rejoicing. And all this would flip at the resurrection. They would be literally, the disciples, lamenting and grieving and weeping at his crucifixion. But yet the grief that they were experiencing would turn to joy at his resurrection when he would see them again. And it would be this kind of joy that nobody could ever take away from him. That's what Yeshua was teaching him here. And Yeshua, you'll notice, let me back up here again. Yeshua used this metaphor of a woman in labor to reinforce what he's saying here. He said that his death would be like the pain of childbirth, and his resurrection would be like the birth of the child. Now, I do not claim to be an expert on giving birth. But Yeshua is saying that once a child is born, the joy is so great that the pain no longer matters. It's all about the mother's joy of having the child and putting her pregnancy and delivery behind her, and now holding the child. Can you think back to Isaac and Sarah in that same way, and how her kind of cynical laughter, which is kind of maybe an expression of grieving, turns to true joy and true laughter? Well, you see, this is what the resurrection of Yeshua does for all of us here. As believers, we talk so much about the pain that Yeshua had to endure in order to provide the necessary payment for our own sins, that we need to be reminded that his resurrection should redirect our focus to the great blessing of everlasting life that we've been given through the power of the resurrection. It's telling us that there needs to be a continual joy in our lives. We never lose our humility. We never lose our sorrow over our sin, but we need to have our focus on our joy of the resurrection. Because if you just beat yourself up all the day long, you will not progress. It's human nature. You've got to claim the victory to move forward in your life. And so having a focus on the resurrection will help us to do that. And the reason is not because the circumstances in our life suddenly become wonderful. Because life can be very, very treacherous and difficult. But the reason we can maintain the joy in our lives in the midst of all the circumstances that we face is because Yeshua has won the victory over sin and death through his resurrection. That is what this passage in John is teaching us. So just as the Son lives on in glory and majesty, in a place where there is no sorrow or pain, he has promised to grant us our own place in that perfect destination by virtue of the promise of our own resurrection that we are given when we believe in Yeshua. See, it's all about having the right perspective. This is changing our perspective on the circumstances of this world and to beholding what God is holding forth to us in glory and knowing what is behind us at the cross. Spiritual maturity means being able to see things as God does. He knew that Sarah would bring forth life to a son named Isaac in advance. And the same is true in this story in John 16, in the way that Yeshua knew that the grave would bring forth life again to the Son of God even before he went to the cross. And I trust that we all can see that the same reality applies to all of us when we believe in Yeshua. For God knows already, knew before we were born, knew from the very beginning of time that we would live in eternity, those of us who are the elect who believe. And then forever free from the pains and doubts that we all face now. God has known our entire life story all along. So why should we doubt him at any given moment in our lives to care for us and to be guiding us into spiritual maturity? Now, for each one of us, that path to spiritual maturity is going to take a slightly different route. But ultimately, it is for the same goal: to be conformed to the image and likeness of God. So when we are able to gain that perspective, it should help us to navigate through the circumstances of life. But of course, the real challenge comes when we face one of the great difficulties of life. You can think of any number of them. There are times when we all come against something that appears to be impossible to overcome. Okay, not just doubtful, but impossible to overcome. On the one hand, we are given exhortations like Yeshua made when he said that we can move mountains if we have the kind of faith of a mustard seed. You know, that's one of those hyperboles that Yeshua was really strong on. Here in John chapter 16, Yeshua said something similar in verse 23. He's talking about this future day of his resurrection. Remember now, he was talking about initially the grief of the cross, the joy of the resurrection. Now he's continuing on about the resurrection. In that day, you will not question me about anything. You see, they will know. Truly, truly, I say to you, if you ask the Father for anything in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have asked for nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, so that your joy might be made full. See the connection there? Now, the word anything is a very broad category, including that which is difficult or impossible. In our Bible study last week, we studied how God would do the impossible. He would give King Ahaz the opportunity to ask for a sign that was as deep as Sheol and high as heaven, which is the reigns of everything, including the impossible. He wouldn't do it, but God said, I will give you a sign then. And what is it? It's the birth of an impossible child, one to a virgin. And that was fulfilled in Yeshua. This is a very similar kind of thing that he's talking about here. So we have these exhortations to be bold in what we ask of God in our prayer life and for the direction of our lives in a general sense. But on the other hand, the book of James tells us that we will not receive what we ask for when we ask with the wrong motives. How do you reconcile those two things? You see, it is true that there is nothing that is too difficult for God. Like he was telling Sarah and telling Abraham in Genesis 18. But he will never do anything that contradicts his nature. He cannot lie, for example, because he is always a God of perfect truth. And he will never do anything that goes against his expressed will, especially in regard to his redemptive plan for this world. He will never do the kinds of things that Satan, the adversary, tempted Yeshua to do at the beginning of his ministry. He will never do something that is outside of his will. That's the balance to these exhortations that we're reading here. That is why we cannot expect God to grant a request that is inconsistent with his will. You know the saying, careful what you ask for? That is the key. You need to be bold in your willingness to ask for God, but what is it that you will ask of him? That is the actual challenge. It is too simplistic of a view of this passage to interpret it as God being like a spiritual vending machine. Put in the coin, get what you want, get the snack that you want. God is not like that. Okay, and that's why I'm talking about spiritual maturity here. I'm not talking about the simplistic thinking that some people do, that have either not been truly born again or have not grown in their faith. So it is clear that our perspective needs to take into account the condition of our heart when evaluating our motives. And it needs to take into account God's expressed will for our lives so that the two can line up. That's the key here. Line up your will with the will of God. The more complete understanding of Yeshua's exhortation is that God will allow us to receive anything that is in alignment with his will. That is why, for example, when we ask God for healing with boldness, we also need to include requests for his provision of strength and perseverance and peace and the ability to depend on him totally. It should never be such a narrow focus that we that we don't allow room for whatever God's will is for our lives. So that's why our requests need to encompass all of His will, and we then will receive from that request what is within His will. In the case of Sarah, God had explicitly declared His will, namely that He would bring forth a son as the next generation of the covenant nation. Sarah wasn't initially inclined to acknowledge His will. That's why she scoffed with her laugh. She wasn't equipped to be the kind of spiritually mature woman of faith who could resist the temptation to doubt and to laugh derisively. She wasn't there yet. But by God's grace, in spite of her initial weakness, Sarah became that kind of a woman. In the same way, Yeshua's disciples weren't ready at first to demonstrate spiritual maturity. We see a lot of things that they're saying that are not really up to par in what Yeshua is expecting of them. They are very different people at the end of His ministry. And after Yeshua left this earth, they're very, very different people. They weren't able to even comprehend the totality of what Yeshua had come to do. Yeshua had to teach them how to understand God's perspective regarding His plan of redemption for the entire world that's centered around His death and resurrection. That's what He was doing here. He's teaching them. He gave them this teaching, but He also said that they fully wouldn't comprehend it until the actual day came. In that day refers to the day when they would comprehend God's perspective regarding the death and resurrection of Yeshua. He said that in that day, when those things occurred, they would know what to ask for because they would have God's perspective. See, the same is true for all of us. When you totally understand the place of the death and the resurrection of Yeshua in your life, the price that He paid for you to have your everlasting life, and the fact that you do have everlasting life, and that it can never be taken away from you, and that you have a calling in your life now to be a witness and a testimony to the very last breath that you have, you will know what to ask for. We have been equipped by contemplating the message of God's Word because we realize that there is more to life than pleasure and convenience. The only question that remains is how we will respond to the challenging circumstances of life when they arise. What will your motives be? Will you have the kind of perspective that is not about the mere comforts of life, but one that recognizes God's big picture for redeeming this world and His will for your own life by bringing about spiritual maturity, to use every aspect of your life for His purposes? Every aspect, from your first breath to your last one. Will it be one that glorifies God, that will contribute to the kingdom of God, even in ways that you cannot even imagine? If so, the result for every day of your life will be true joy. Not because you receive some kind of a benefit in this world, but because God is at work within you and in the world around you from now until eternity. It is the joy of having God's perspective, not our own. That is how we can laugh joyfully with God now and forevermore, regardless of the circumstances of life.